Pretty soon, the field was filled with people. I stood back against the wall. It was actually a little scary. And at the open end of the stadium, the end closest to Route 1, fans had commandeered one of the metal goalposts, had actually shaken it from its foundation, and were carrying it out. Well, I didn't learn about what happened until afterwards, but I could see the goalposts departing the stadium. It was easy to spot them.
Glenn Stout is the series editor of The Best American Sports Writing, the author of The Young Woman and the Sea and Fenway 1912. Glenn has collaborated with Richard Johnson on Red Sox Century, Yankees Century, the Cubs, and the Dodgers. He lives in Alberg, Vermont. Richard Johnson is the author of New England Patriots, Yesterday and Today. He is also the curator of the Sports Museum of New England. A native of Worcester, he currently lives in Braintree. And Leigh Montville is a former sports columnist for the Boston Globe and former senior writer for Sports Illustrated. He has written 9 books, including New York Times bestsellers about Dale Earnhardt, Ted Williams, and Babe Ruth. He lives in Medfield. And unfortunately, due to a death in the family, Howard Bryant will not be able to join us this evening. So now, please join me in a warm welcome for Glenn, Richard, and Leigh.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here this evening. I will be both a moderator and a participant, so I'm a sort of a player coach here this evening. It's especially meaningful to me because I began my curatorial career here as an intern in the print department in 1976. The same year the Patriots had the roughing the passer call. So I'm going to start by throwing the first question to Glenn, and that is, describe the effect of the 1958 NFL championship game on the founding of the American Football League with the so-called foolish club of owners and the rather interesting origins of the Patriots.
Well, that was one of the challenges, was to how to start a book like this, because we know the Patriots began in 1960, but what was the impetus behind them? So I start the book actually with the championship game between the Colts and the Giants in 1958. And what was surprising to me is I researched that game, because that's when a lot of people looked around and realized pro football was really popular, because that game was such a success on television, and they also looked around and realized a lot of money could be made off pro football, particularly a lot of rich people who had money to burn and wanted an NFL franchise all of a sudden. But what was interesting about that is, as I researched that game, is that it was blacked out in New York. So if you were a Giants fan in New York, you couldn't see that championship game. But what happened is all these cars streamed north out of New York into southern New England looking for a bar that had a television or a motel that had a free TV sign out in front of it so they could watch that championship game. Well, one of the people that paid attention to the interest in that game was Billy Sullivan. Billy Sullivan was a coal company executive. He was the former PR person for Boston College, for the Boston Braves, for Boston College coach Frank Leahy, and Billy was immediately interested in trying to get a sports franchise together. He once said he didn't want to be a non-entity. That was his fear. And I think he saw that owning a sports franchise and or building a stadium was a way for him not to be a non-entity. And when the AFL got together and all the rich guys got together, people like Hilton, of the Hilton family, people with millions and millions of dollars, Billy was initially boxed out. But a franchise scheduled to go into Minnesota had to back out at the last minute. They were promised that they would get in the NFL all of a sudden. And Billy Sullivan was the guy that cobbled together 11 investors to come up with that $25,000 fee that they needed to join the AFL, because they needed 8 teams, because without 8 teams they would have an unbalanced schedule. And they needed everyone to to play each other twice to make it all work. So Billy Sullivan got those guys together, and that was really the impetus to begin the Patriots, was that 58 playoff game and the monetary potential that everyone saw in televised football. And of course that was recognized by ABC initially, which gave the AFL its first television contract.
$25,000 for a franchise. Before I came over today, I was looking at the wire, or not the wire, but my smartphone, and investors in Seattle ponied up $650 million for an NHL franchise in Seattle. Times have changed, haven't they? Leigh, as a Connecticut native, you've certainly observed firsthand the preeminence of what we used to call the New York football giants as the region's team of choice. Describe sort of how that phenomena was sort of prevailed here, even during the AFL years, and then how would you gauge, or how long do you think it took the Patriots to battle that, to finally gain a foothold in the region?
How does this thing work?
Oh, here we go. You're in business.
There we go. All right. That game in 1958, I was 15 years old in New Haven, Connecticut, and all those New York people came up to our town, and they were at Rudy's Tavern, and it was only on UHF or something. It was only in bars, and my friend and I, we tried to get in the bar to watch the game, and the guy threw us out. So we watched the game through the window of the bar, and everybody was cheering and it was getting all steamed up. We went home for halftime, and we came back, and then as the game ended, we snuck into the bar, and it was like the first time we'd ever really been in the bar. And everybody was drinking happy and despondent because the Colts had won. I don't know. I think in Massachusetts, it was a long, long time before the people here grew up with the New York Giants, and the Giants are very good. And it was a long time. I came along, I covered the team in 1968, and it was still the feeling that the Giants were kind of the team that really mattered around here, that the Patriots were sort of a minor league operation. And I don't know, maybe all the way up till they went to that first Super Bowl in New Orleans. You know, I mean, people of a certain age are still Giant fans. You know, like the last Japanese, and you know, the war has ended. You know, they're up in Vermont and still rooting for the Giants.
We had somebody call into an interview we did in Vermont saying, like, well, I don't really think that the Patriots are a New England team, and he was an old Giants fan. And the Giants, of course, even had the training camp. They used to hold it in Burlington, Vermont.
Yeah.
So long tradition up there of Giants fans.
They did it in Fairfield, Connecticut, too. And when we grew old enough to go into the bars on our own, we would go down to Fairfield, Connecticut, and there were bars down there where the Giants would be, and we'd go, ooh, there's Y.A. Tittle. He's had a lot to drink, you know. You know, it was good.
Well, you think of the rocky soil, that pro football had to plant its seeds here in Boston. And of course, the 5 teams that preceded the Patriots were, in chronological order, the Bulldogs in 1929. The events in October of that year, I'm afraid, sealed their fate. Then the Braves, who became the Redskins. The Shamrocks. There was a team called the Boston Bears, and the second version of the American Football League, who played at Fenway Park in 1940, a team I only learned of on eBay when I did a search for Fenway football programs. And all of a sudden, there were these 2 programs for a team called the Boston Bears. Well, I bought them, of course, and but that has to be the most obscure pro football team we had. And then the absolute folly of marketing in naming a team called the Boston Yanks in the mid to late 40s. What was up with that? I don't quite understand. And of course, the Yanks became the New York Yankee football team, owned by Dan Topping. They then folded and eventually became the Baltimore Colts. So, on a schedule where the Patriots play the Redskins and the Colts, they are playing two ancestors. So it was in that, it was really looking at the chimneys and the rubble of 5 broken franchises that the Patriots emerged. Okay, now, Glenn, what were the surprises in the research that you did on this book? Were there any gems that just jumped out at you early on? I can remember a story about the Chargers and a certain chemical help that they had in their '63 championship year that I found very interesting, that I had never heard before, but I'm sure there are others.
Yeah, that was one of the favorite stories in doing the book, is in 1963, the Patriots actually made the American Football League championship game, and they played the San Diego Chargers in San Diego. Couple of things happened beforehand, and I'm sure everyone here is familiar with Spygate. Well, Spygate has a long history with the Patriots, and it begins, well, there actually was an incident of spying in the Patriots' first game that they ever played, where the coach of the Denver Broncos, they played at Nickerson Field, he took an evening constitutional, walked out of his hotel from Kenmore Square, saw the lights on at the field, and watched the Patriots practice the night before they played the Patriots. Needless to say, Denver won that game. But in 1963, the Patriots went out to San Diego, and Sid Gilman, the coach of the Chargers, was very gracious. They set them up to practice at a naval facility, and as legend goes, the Chargers sent people in naval uniforms with clipboards like Richard is holding, pretending to be Navy officers, and they were actually scouting the Patriots. The other thing that happened is that Gilman had installed, based on their scouting apparently, some new plays to counteract what the Patriots were doing. And a couple of days before the game, Will McDonough, the famous reporter of the Boston Globe, did a story in the Globe. He interviewed Mike Holovac, and the subtitle was "What to Watch For on Television." Well, it wasn't just what to watch for on television, it was what Sid Gilman should watch for. Mike Holovac gives away the entire game plan. He refers to a special running play they're doing. He says, we're going to fake the safety blitz all game with Ron Hall, and he's going to then go back into coverage. And we even know that there's a guy on the Chargers who tips the defense every game. Well, any questions that Sid Gilman had about their pre-scouting was answered in that story by Will McDonough. And in that game, of course, San Diego scores 3 touchdowns right off the bat. They end up winning 51-10. They were ahead by so much that at halftime, Sid Gilman didn't really have anything to say. And he went out and he watched the Grambling College show band do their halftime show rather than, doing strategy with his team. Come to find out, though, some years later, that the Chargers that year had an ace up their sleeve. Their trainer had formerly worked for the U.S. Olympic program and had met some of his Russian counterparts. He was introduced to this substance called Dianabol, which is a steroid. And in 1963, the San Diego Chargers, from the beginning of training camp throughout the entire season, were on steroids. One of their players commented that by the end of the year, some of the linemen looked like Popeye. And it was it makes sense when you look at the last two games of the season, where the Chargers in the playoffs scored over 100 points in 2 games. The Patriots were on fumes. The Chargers were feeling pretty good. So that cost the Patriots a chance at their first championship. But that was, in combination, that was a story that I'd never heard before.
Better life through chemistry, they said back in the day. I think it's interesting to note, again, one of the jobs I did with this book was basically to quarterback the art direction of it. And as a 63-year-old Patriots fan, and I'm not really a football fan, but I love the Patriots because I grew up with them, and I grew up with, if someone mentioned Ike, to me it was Larry Eisenhower, not Dwight Eisenhower. And one of the things I love about the team was that their identity early on was the creation of a cartoonist. Phil Bissell, who's going strong at age 93, created a Patriot cartoon upon the announcement of the formation of the team in 1959. And It's interesting that the first year of play, the Patriots had as their helmet emblem a tri-corner hat. Well, that's another homespun item. It was created by a gentleman named Walter Pingree, who was a Boston and Maine railroad conductor, who gave the design to the Sullivans, just saying, I think this would look good on your helmet, and they used it. Well, for year two, though, they had already considered doing a logo change, and I guess they hired a couple of ad agencies to do schematics for that. And the story goes that the ad men were at the Sullivan household one evening, and they had the drawing spread out on the floor. They had talked for a couple of hours about it. No decision was made. Finally, in exasperation, Billy Sullivan asked his son Patrick, who had come down to say goodnight at the time he was probably grade school age, and said, Patrick, which image would you choose for the helmet? Well, what do you like? He looked at the images that were spread on the floor and then pointed to a framed cartoon on the wall in his father's study, which was the Pat Patriot hiking the ball. So as Phil tells the story to me, of course, that cartoon was given to Billy Sullivan without his permission. Phil and Globe Sports editor Jerry Nason were not real friends, unfortunately, and so what ended up happening was once Sullivan sort of heard the story that, this image had been appropriated, he approached Phil and said, gee, is it okay? A, B, let's have a deal on things. I want to make sure you're treated properly. And the deal was a handshake deal. He would draw the program covers for the first 10 years of the, since that time. The first year, actually, there were a couple of artists who did drawings. And Vic Johnson was one, and his cartoons were great as well. But Phil was really the guy that created the graphic identity of the team that was playful and witty, wise, and wonderful. And those today on eBay go from anywhere from a little over $100 to over $200. They're beautiful program covers. And I still think that even now, in 2018, the Pat Patriot is still the most beloved symbol of the team. The Flying Elvis may have won Super Bowl rings, but Pat Patriot is the granddaddy. Now, back to Leigh. Leigh, you wrote a beautiful essay in our book about really the star-crossed and troubled head coach, Cleve Rush. Tell us a little bit about Cleve Rush.
Okay, he became the coach in 1969, right? The Patriots were going to fire Mike Holovac, who'd given away the game secrets, I guess, in '63, and they decided they wanted good offense, so they were going to hire the offensive coordinator of whichever team won the Super Bowl, and that was Super Bowl III, and then the Baltimore Colts were heavily favored to win Super Bowl III, but the New York Jets upset them. So they hired Cleve Rush, who was the offensive coordinator of the New York Jets, whereas Chuck Noll, who later won 4 Super Bowls or whatever for the Pittsburgh Steelers, was the offensive coordinator of the Baltimore Colts. So if only the game had gone according to the way it was, they would have had a great coach. Instead, they had this guy who had emotional and mental problems and just couldn't handle it. He was, I don't know, I was young, I was like 25 years old, and I was covering the team, and right off the bat he said, "Are you fact or flair?" And I really didn't know, but I kind of swallowed and said, I guess I'm flair more than fact, And he was looking for fact, and it was like the fake news kind of thing. And you would go in and he would talk to you for 2 hours, and he would say, "I'm going to call up Bud Wilkinson, and we'll talk to Bud Wilkinson." He'd call up Bud Wilkinson, and he just did wacky things. And he would call my house when he was mad about some story I wrote, and he would say, "Leigh, who's your lawyer?" And I said, "I'm 25 years old. I just got married. I don't have a lawyer." And he said, "Well, you better get one, because my lawyer is Melvin Belli, this famous lawyer in San Francisco, and we're going to sue you for everything you got because you wrote this story about Tom Sherman, the quarterback or something, And So it was just a torturous relationship with him, and he wound up, they wound up locking him in his hotel room. The Patriots were playing at Harvard Stadium, and they stayed in a hotel over by Harvard, and he was just off the wall. He was taking all kinds of pills, and they locked him in his room, kind of, and they had an assistant coach take over the game with the Baltimore Colts, and all of a sudden he somehow got out, and he came walking and came onto the sidelines in the middle of the game and kind of took over again, and it was just a sad situation all around.
Well, I remember hearing stories. I got a wonderful call at the Sports Museum once, it was probably 25 years ago, from a woman whose father was the caretaker at White Stadium near Logan Airport. There are two White stadiums in Boston. One's in Roxbury, the other's over near the airport. And she said, I have all this game film of the Patriots that my dad basically prevented from being thrown away. I mean, because they used to have practice over at White Stadium. I don't know for how many years, but for at least 3 or 4 years, probably the same years they were going up to Arthur's farm in Revere. And so she told the story of how her father was the caretaker. They would ask to use his office under the stands, which was basically, bags of grass seed and fertilizer and some crates. So the players would sit on crates and watch the game films projected on a bed sheet tacked to the wall. That's sort of the history of this team. So if you were scripting a movie on the history of the club, I think a great start to it would be you hear the clickety-clack of the projector and the grainy film is of Babe Parilli launching a pass that's completed by Tom Brady to Gronk in the end zone in a Super Bowl. But anyway, let me get back to sort of, we're doing this almost in a chronological way too. Glenn, the saga of the creation of, well, first of all, the selection of Foxborough and then the building of Schaefer Stadium is a story unto itself. I remember at one of the appearances we had made, you thought that could even be a book unto itself. Tell us a little bit about that story.
I don't know if anybody would read a book about the trials of building a stadium for the Patriots, but it would be much thicker than this one, because over their history there were so many different stadium plans. And Billy Sullivan, from the very beginning, that was half of his interest in owning the team, was he wanted to get a stadium built. He thought that that was his entree into the business of being a developer in New England. He could make a lot of money. And what Billy didn't have, Billy had a lot of charm, but a lot of people didn't buy Billy's charm. So Billy was never able to grease enough skids among the machinations of Boston and Massachusetts government to get somebody else to build a stadium for him, and he didn't really have the money on his own. But they finally arrived at Foxborough, and it was, that's where the Bay State Raceway was.
Owned by E.M. Lowe.
Owned by E.M. Lowe. I think they let him use it for $1 or sold it for $1 because it would also be good for the track if there was a stadium there. And when everybody else was closing the doors, they couldn't play at Fenway anymore. Harvard didn't want them. BC was too small. By that time, Nickerson Field really wasn't available to them either. So we had to build a stadium. They built Sullivan Stadium. It was about the most utilitarian football stadium ever built. And one symbol of just how utilitarian it was is that for the purposes of paying union labor, the stadium itself was designated a highway because much of the construction went into the creation of an earthen embankment that served as a support for the stands. And that was more like a highway embankment or a big curved highway than it was a stadium. There were problems from the start, most namely when they had their first game there and everyone went to the bathroom and flushed the toilets. Well, what happened? Well, the water ran the wrong way, and people were sloshing through Sullivan Stadium in 4 to 6 inches of water. Now, some people said that was because the pressure tanks were too small. Some said it was because the plumbers purposely put in pipes that were too small due to a labor issue. They also apparently installed the urinals a little too high. So you actually had to stand back and, take aim to use the urinals as much. And the Patriots ended up spending thousands and thousands of dollars to fix that. And it also inspired what became known as the Great Flush, where there's the selectmen of Foxborough wouldn't let them play there if it didn't pass the health department test. And that required the Patriots, and players chipped in, sports writers chipped in, but they all had to demonstrate that the plumbing actually worked. So on a signal, they all went around and flushed all the toilets at Sullivan Stadium to make sure it operated. And the stories about Sullivan Stadium, anybody who ever went there, they recall being in traffic for hours. They recall sitting on the seats and either burning their rear ends if it was sunny because the aluminum seats would get so hot, or freezing their rear ends off because they were so cold. And I have a friend of mine who went to one game, took a bus from the North Shore down to Sullivan Stadium. It was so cold when he got there, he left his friends who came down by bus to get a beer. He decided the heck with it. He stuck out his thumb on Route 1, and he watched the rest of the game from a bar in Boston. They ended up getting back a couple hours late because they spent hours looking for him, wondering where he'd gone. That's the kind of place that Sullivan Stadium was.
Leigh, I'm guessing you were at some of the infamous Monday night games that caused the Patriots to be banned from Monday Night Football for a number of years. I think for decades.
I probably was, but it's all one big game in my head. It's one kind of thing. I don't know. It was quite a place, Sullivan Stadium. I don't know. It was like the IKEA of sports stadiums. They put together really cheap.
Yeah, or a Levittown house with drywall and plywood. I was at the game, the very infamous game in December of 1985. They were playing the Bengals on December 22nd that year, with a chance to clinch a wild card berth. And it was a game, actually I was there, the Sports Museum was selling tickets to a concert at Symphony Hall, a benefit for us that featured Bo Diddley and Roy Orbison. And so we were selling tickets, but it was only through halftime because the crowd was so bad. And I won't go into a clinical description of what was happening, but it was really pretty, it was pretty ugly. Anyway, but part of the deal was I had a field pass to the game. All right, I went down to the sidelines and watched the second half of this wonderful game where the Patriots won and clinched a wild card berth. And the resulting melee that occurred following the game is legendary because fans were jumping onto the field. There's about a 6-foot drop from the front row stands onto the field, but that didn't deter anybody. Folks were, jumping off the side of that like images of the Titanic being evacuated. And pretty soon, the field was filled with people. I stood back against the wall. It was actually a little scary. And at the open end of the stadium, the end closest to Route 1, fans had commandeered one of the metal goalposts, had actually shaken it from its foundation, and were carrying it out. Well, I didn't learn about what happened until afterwards, but I could see the goalposts departing the stadium. It was easy to spot them. And these guys were electrocuted going out of the stadium. Now, no one was killed, but only in Massachusetts would this happen. A number of them won settlements. They actually made money off of being drunken louts, departing a stadium carrying goalposts onto Route 1 where the tension wires, okay, it was dark at the end of the game, but come on. It is such a weird story, and we have in the book a great photo by Stan Grossfeld, the Pulitzer Prize winning Stan Grossfeld, showing a fan on the goalpost, helping to shake them from their foundation. That's just one of the many stories that I had heard about that. Of course, the Monday night games, there weren't many to begin with because the crowd would get there at around 2 or 3 in the afternoon and begin drinking. So by the 8 p.m. kickoff, anything goes, baby, and it did, and it was bad. And for the NFL to step in and ban the Patriots from those games was really quite a statement about the environment and the atmosphere there. But anyway, that's a part of the heritage. And it was interesting doing the photo research for this book. I had free roam of the Getty Images site, which I thought, oh, there've got to be great images of Monday Night Football, but I think that these were scrubbed because the only picture I could find in any of the wire services of sort of the drunken Hieronymus Bosch-like atmosphere there was a very, I think, modest picture of a Foxborough patrolman holding 2 cans of beer, walking through the stands, beer that he had confiscated during a game. That was nothing like the stories that I had heard, but it was the only image I could find. So out there has to be some unexpurgated file of images of the debauchery that occurred there. But so if anyone here knows anyone that has those, even though it won't make the hardcover, maybe they'll make the paperback.
You know, Harold Keza, the great sports writer for the Globe, he wrote a story about trying to get to the first game at Foxborough because, of course, the traffic jams were legendary. I referred to it as the longest rolling bar in New England because you were parked in traffic for so long. The tall boys were open long before you got to the gate, and it was somewhat safely because you weren't going more than a mile or 2 an hour. But he gives a running account of leaving Fenway Park and trying to get to Foxborough for the first game, and it's like a diary, you know, Neponset Circle, 3:30, and then, you know, it's 4:30 and he's a couple miles farther, and finally the game has started and he's sitting in his car and he sees someone pass him pushing someone in a wheelchair, and at that he threw up his hands and turned around, and he said it was the only time that he, you know, tried to attend a sporting event that he just gave up and went home. That's Foxborough Stadium for you. Sullivan Stadium, Schaefer Stadium, the one to have when you want more than one. Not a motto that would be used today, I don't think.
And the traffic is still, I mean, and there's several games that I have turned down, and I regret not having taken a ticket to the Oakland playoff game in 2002. I had a chance to go to that game. I'm sorry, all I could think of was, it's snowing, I'll get down there, I'm not going to get home until 5 in the morning. Yeah, I should have gone. Kind of throw.
I was to say, I'm not going to get home till 5 in the morning.
You're not going to get home until 5 in the morning. Hooray! But let me throw a question to Leigh. You wrote about Cleve Rush for the book. If that topic had been taken, what other Patriot-related topic or Patriot-related person would you have been eager to write about?
Oh, I don't know. One more thing about Cleve Rush. When he got fired, they were training at Curry College in Milton, and he showed up at his office, and we were all there, and he had a dog under his arm, and he walked in with the dog, this little dog, and everybody thought it was kind of strange that he showed up. But we said, hey, how are you? And he took the dog and he said to Ron Hobson from the Quincy Patriot Ledger, he said, Ron, would you hold my dog? And Ron said, sure. And he went to punch Clark Booth from Channel 5, you know? And this whole day wheeled out of control. Cardinal Cushing had died and was kind of, that was the big news of the day. And he wound up somehow half drunk at the Cardinals' residence out on Lake Street in Brighton, and it was all quite a thing. I don't know. There's just been a lot of characters that you'd like to write about, you know. Randy Vataha I liked him. He'd worked he became a wide receiver. He'd worked for a couple summers as a dwarf at Disneyland in California. That's not big recruiting territory, Disneyland and the dwarfs. I don't know. There were just a bunch of guys that came through there, and good guys, but they just couldn't do much.
I think the early history of the team was proof of the Hunter Thompson adage of when the going gets weird, the weird turn pro. And it's a quote that I refer to these days in other aspects of life in America. But Glenn, the difference between writing football history and baseball history, we've collaborated on 4 team histories previously on the Red Sox, Yankees, Cubs, and Dodgers. What were the differences and what were some of the challenges and, again, some of the surprises in comparing doing work on the 2 topics?
Well, in a sense, they were very similar because, when you try to tell the story of an entire history of a team, you have to do more than just tell one story after another. You have to try to look at the full arc and see if there's a full story in there somewhere. And with the Patriots, there is this natural arc because you have laughingstock to dynasty. That is the arc of this franchise. So that was very helpful. But a lot of it comes from the reporting of people like Leigh and his contemporaries that covered the team on a daily basis. There's a wealth of material. But the one thing that was really useful with writing about the Patriots as opposed to, say, the Red Sox or the Yankees is that so much of their history is still preserved on film. So you can actually look at film footage of things that took place that's not quite as available with the baseball teams. For instance, there's a famous game from 1961, of course, this is in the laughingstock era, where at the end of this game, the Patriots were playing the Dallas Texans. And there's time for one play left. If the Texans score, they win. If they don't score, they lose. And you can actually look at the film of this. You can find it on YouTube. As the play's being set up, the fans are crowded around the end of the end zone. A guy in a khaki jacket runs on the field, takes position next to the referee. The ball is snapped. The pass is thrown. There's one guy on defense who reads the play correctly. It's the fan who ran in from the stands. He reaches up, either bats the pass or blocks the view of the receiver. It goes incomplete. The Patriots win. Another incident was from the famous playoff game known as the Ben Wreath game, where the Patriots were playing the Oakland Raiders, and Oakland is driving at the end of the game. Again, the Patriots are ahead. If Oakland scores, they can win. Kenny Stabler, the Snake, is the quarterback, known for his comebacks. He throws an incompletion, but there's a flag. And the referee, Ben Wreath, calls roughing the passer on Sugar Ray Hamilton, the nose guard for the Patriots. This, in Patriots lore, is the equivalent of Johnny Pesky holding the ball in the World Series. That's what cost them the game. You can look it up on YouTube, and what's interesting, there's 2 angles you can watch it at. From the angle from above, it looks like that was a bad call. He barely touched him. But what I thought was interesting, there's another viewpoint of it that's from field level. And if you look at it from field level, and presumably that's where Ben Wreath was watching it from on the field, it looks like Sugar Ray hammers Kenny Stabler. So, Patriot fans saying that shouldn't have been a call. Well, that might be a little overstated. And then you do more research and you find out maybe it was the play they used at the end of the first half where they called an option pass to be thrown by tight end Russ Francis, and he throws an interception. Maybe it wouldn't have been a great idea to have a tight end who'd never thrown a pass in the NFL try to throw a pass in such an important game. But that was the real benefit of this, is I could actually go back and see some of the film footage, because you do want to have some game description. Although in a book of this kind, I think it gets tedious if you just have game description after game description. And that's why we had people like Leigh or Howard Bryant and some other friends of ours write essays to kind of give the book a different texture, to give a different perspective. But I used to work here at the Boston Public Library, where I would spend hours and hours and hours looking at microfilm to write about the Red Sox or write about the Yankees. And I spent just as much time looking at the old newspaper reportage, because once upon a time they actually had to tell you what happened, not give a hot take after something has happened. And that's how you're able to recreate not just games, but seasons, and hopefully, some of the flavor of what it was like to be a Patriots fan, to watch this franchise be transformed from, a laughingstock into a dynasty.
Well, I'm glad you brought a measure of objectivity to this book, because Ben Wreath, to me, shares the same middle name with Bucky Dent. But one story that I think is sort of a great story about, where the foundation of the house that this team was built on was the story of, and I refer to it in an essay I did at the start of the book, the introduction of pro football to Boston. New England is really the cradle of the game itself. The great Walter Camp at Yale named the positions, created the gridiron, was sort of the architect of the game. He was, in fact, to football what people thought Abner Doubleday was to baseball. He was the real deal. And the game, grew in various colleges, prep schools, high schools here, and is still a rich territory. We're still home to the biggest little game in the country between Amherst and Williams. Well, anyway, pro football was a newcomer here, and in 1927, there's a game about which you could write a movie script. It would actually be pretty good. There was a Knights of Columbus Lodge, the Pierre Marquette Lodge, which is still on Old Colony Avenue in South Boston. And they had a number of sports teams. They had very competitive teams playing semi-pro in football, basketball, hockey, and baseball. And their football team was really pretty good. Among the players on that team was national decathlon champion Tony Plansky from South Boston. In November of 1927, the Piers play an exhibition game against the New York Football Giants at Fenway Park in November of 1927. They play it on a Saturday, and, again, challenged a bit because they played it opposite the Harvard-Yale game at Harvard Stadium, but they still managed to attract 10,000 spectators. They lost the game pretty heavily, but it was the audition. It was sort of the tryout for Boston as a city for the National Football League. And in 1929, sure enough, we got a team. In between, interestingly enough, an answer to a trivia question, who was the last New England team to win an NFL championship prior to the Patriots? It was the Providence Steamroller in 1928. So in that year where they were gathering the investors and deciding to bring a team to Boston, Little Providence had an NFL team that won it all. So again, the Patriots stand on rather interesting shoulders in terms of their history. But anyway, I digress a bit. But Leigh, do you remember the first game you covered and for the Patriots? And then also tell us a little bit about the group that you are a part of, who are reporters who covered the team over the decades. There is a tried and true group of you that gather each year.
Yeah, no, I don't remember the first game I covered for the Patriots, no. See, these guys are involved in this book every day. I'm just coming in from the outside. I have nothing. I'm just speaking from the side. We do have a group of guys that used to cover the Patriots a long time ago, and every year we go to Agawam, Massachusetts for some reason, and we stay for a weekend at a red carpet inn, and we play golf for 2 days and play cards, and we just talk about the old times and never about this guy Tom Brady and all the success that's happened, All we talk about is all this stupid stuff, and there's a lot to discuss. It's funny that there are these guys and all this success never really counted, I left covering the Patriots just around the time Tom Brady came in. I remember going they won the first Super Bowl, and some magazine sent me out to do a story on Tom Brady, this magnificent guy that somehow pulled it out. And I went out to Foxborough, and the new stadium was being built, but the offices were still from the old stadium. And I had talked to Brady on the phone, and I thought that was it, and I was going to go out there. But Will McDonough was in the parking lot, and he was Mr. Inside Football, and I said, what are you doing here? And he said, I'm going to go talk to Tom Brady. And I said, gee, can I come along with you? So we went in, and the whole time was Will McDonough telling Tom Brady what was going to happen. He said, you know, you can't make good friends. He says, because you're going to be here and everybody else is going to be gone. He said, look at Drew Bledsoe. He's friends with Ben Coates. Ben Coates is out of here. He said, you're the guy that's going to stay for all this time. And you know, 19 years later, he was exactly right. And Tom Brady said, well, where should I live? And Will said, well, my son lives down in Quincy at the marina. And Tom Brady went to Quincy at the marina. He said, you should get your own radio deal. You shouldn't get in any radio deal with the Patriots. And he's got his own radio deal, you know. And Will said, I don't know if you want to know any more about this. He said, no, this is what I want to know. And it was kind of funny because of all the things that Brady has become since then.
Will would have been a really good owner because that's what I think he really identified himself as, you know, a guy who was in, you know, the luxury suite, sort of hanging out with those guys. Very wise owl is the way I would describe him. And we are going to open this up now. You've heard enough from us. We want to hear from you, so we would like you to feel free to ask us whatever questions you would like to ask.
Or if you've got a Patriot story, just tell it.
Right, exactly.
Was there ever a time when they almost went under financially, or did ABC and the money keep them going?
Well, I mean, I think they were almost under financially a lot, but I think the closest, well, I think really the closest times they came to going under were in the early 80s when, you know, Billy was essentially filing bankruptcy and he was getting second mortgages on the stadium, and, you know, they decided this was going to bail him out when they were going to sponsor the Victory Tour for Michael Jackson. And they thought this was going to be the way they were going to make a lot of money. I mean, Chuck Sullivan, Billy's son, had been at BC, and he'd promoted a few concerts there, so why not run the biggest musical tour to date, you know? And they just didn't know how to do it. So, I mean, I think they were very, very close. There was a time the NFL had to bail them out and guarantee salaries because Billy just didn't have the money.
In the early 80s.
Yeah.
Well, I remember hearing a story. I don't think we included this in the book, but it, you know, again, it would be a vignette in the movie about the history of this team. Story I heard was that Chuck Sullivan at one point lived in a luxury suite at Sullivan Stadium in the off season, and in the suite, along with, you know, probably a Castro convertible and, you know, a pile of his clothes, was unsold merchandise from the Victory Tour that, of course, they were hoping to sell at Sullivan Stadium, but the town fathers in Foxborough banned them from actually mounting the concert. They were not allowed to even have the concert that they were involved as promoters. Of course,
The quote was because it attracted the wrong element.
well, and of course they were answering to Don King, who was managing the tour for the Jackson family. How on earth did they think that was going to work out for them?
I was a season ticket holder for 10 years at the old Sullivan Stadium. I can't tell you the joy of bringing my family to the north end zone when the train pulled in and they all started falling out the windows. And between the defoliation of the forest around there is when my wife said, we're never going to do this again. So that was quite a place. My question is how close were the Patriots to actually leaving Boston before Kraft came in? We all thought they were gone.
Well, I think, you know, if they did one really smart thing is that Kraft had an out. Well, Connecticut thought they did a really smart thing is that they banned Bob Kraft from negotiating with the state of Massachusetts while the deal in Connecticut was being worked out. But Kraft outsmarted them because he didn't negotiate with the state of Massachusetts, the NFL did. So that was the sideways plan. I don't think if they wouldn't have gotten any funding, I suspect they might have tried to go down there, but that deal was a mess from the beginning. I mean, the site was like a Superfund site, right, Lee? It had to be cleaned up. I think maybe they were closer even before then when James Orthwine owned the team, and he wanted to move them to St. Louis because that was his gambit to get into the NFL. He'd be a caretaker for the Patriots, but he really wanted to move a team into Baltimore where he was involved in the new stadium. They even had a name. They were going to be called the Baltimore Stallions. They even had a logo. Or no, they're not the Baltimore Stallions, sorry, St. Louis. The St. Louis Stallions. They even had a logo and everything. They were ready to go. But, Bob Kraft ended up outbidding him for,
They paid the most that had ever been paid for an NFL team, and apparently Myra Kraft thought her husband had taken leave of his, of his senses when he paid that amount for the team. They're only worth about 15 times what he paid for the team now. It was a very astute purchase, and of course, the purchase was made as much from, the fact that they were fans. They had season tickets. They sat on the cold aluminum. They were at about the 40-yard line, but they were there for the rust years, for, some pretty bad teams. And I can remember that when the press conference was held announcing the sale, Bob Kraft mentioned the fact that as a kid growing up in Brookline, he was heartbroken when the Boston Braves, his favorite team as a child, moved to Milwaukee. And he didn't want that to happen to his football team. And sure enough, and of course, who was the PR director of the Boston Braves at the time? Billy Sullivan. So it all sort of goes around in a circle in Boston sports.
Hi there. My husband, I think one of the first things he showed me was his share of the Sullivan Stadium. And I just wondered how many people did they take a few bucks from to buy one share, a few shares to get that built?
I think you're talking about the Patriots stock. I think it was like 400,000 shares of stock were sold or something. No, and Billy Sullivan later said, they raised a lot of money for it, but Billy Sullivan said later, he says, what a smart businessman I was. He says, I sold this stock, it was like a couple of dollars a share, and he ended up having to pay $15 a share to buy it all back. And he says, shows what a smart businessman I was, But yeah, you could own stock in the Boston Patriots at one point, and that's a real rarity in the NFL. The Packers are owned by their stockholders, and there's a reason for that, because the NFL owners want the money themselves. They want to have to share it with anybody else.
So other people made money on it. My husband just hung on to it and never cashed it in.
Well, he might have made a few dollars, but they didn't let anybody, they were non-voting shares, so they really didn't have a whole lot of value. It was just to raise money for the team.
No, I think it's worth more as an eBay item now than it is in terms of what the actual cash, the value would have been for, selling it back. So hold on to it.
Your anecdote about the toilets and the urinals backfiring, was that discovered at an exhibition game or a practice of the waterworks? And what year was
I think
that?
it was an exhibition game where they had the first incident with that. Was like, and then the town of Foxborough, it became such a big deal. It was a health issue, and they wouldn't issue a certificate of occupancy until they proved that the toilets actually worked, because, people were like, my God, I went to the game and, look what I had to walk through.
About what year was that?
That was
1971.
71, yeah, this the first year it opened.
And the essay in the book about the stadium was written by former team general manager Upton Bell, and it has the wonderful name of The Night the Carburetors Died. Because of the draft. And, it's interesting that we have an aerial photograph of the opening game, and even before halftime, the stands were about half full. Why? Because the other half of the crowd was on Route 1. Absolutely losing their minds trying to get into the damn place. And, it still remains to this day, as I had said before, if I'm offered a ticket, if I'm offered a ticket and, like a suite with shrimp in it and everything, I actually have to think twice, or I have to make up an excuse not to go, because the traffic is the deal breaker to that joint. It still is.
The sun was actually coming up when the last cars left the stadium parking lot after the first regular season game. They didn't get out till dawn. That's how bad the traffic was. Anybody else? Well, I guess thank you for coming.
Yeah, and thank you. This is actually a crowd that approximates a crowd at an early Patriots exhibition game. But we thank you for being here and for coming out in the cold. And certainly there are books available for sale outside. It's a great holiday gift, and we appreciate your presence here. Thank you very much.